Hello, and welcome to the Voice of the Washington Monthly, your source for policy, politics, and fresh ideas. I'm your host, Ann Kim.
And I'm your co-host, Garrett Epps.
The Democratic Party is licking its wounds after a shocking defeat last November. Donald Trump is headed back to the White House despite the heroic campaign of Kamala Harris. Propelling Trump's win was the working class. 56% of non-college voters opted for Trump, including large numbers of Black and Latino Americans. The latest issue of the Washington Monthly offers Democrats a potential path back to power. The cover package is titled 10 New Ideas for the Democratic Party to Help the Working Class and Itself. Joining us today to talk about the new issue is Paul Glastris, Editor-in-Chief of the Washington Monthly. Paul was also a speechwriter for President Bill Clinton, who led Democrats to victory in 1992. This is part one of our discussion with Paul. Welcome, Paul.
Thanks. Great to be here.
So before we dive into the issue, I want to share a clip from Senator Bernie Sanders. He's speaking in a post-election interview with Meet the Press. Now, you haven't always agreed with Senator Sanders, but he seems to share your diagnosis of what went wrong in 2024.
Bottom line, if you're an average working person out there, do you really think that the Democratic Party is going to the mats, taking on powerful special interests and fighting for you? I think the overwhelming answer is no, and that is what has got to change.
So in your thinking for this issue, are you coming from the same place that he is, or do you have a different theory of the case about how to reach the working class?
Well, I think in a general sense, yes. In a specific sense, maybe not so much. I think Senator Sanders is correct that despite the fact that Joe Biden and the Democrats did a lot to try to win over working class voters, and in fact did things that benefited working class voters, in the grand scheme of things, they barely moved the needle because we've had 40 years of policies from Washington that have not kept pace with the needs of the working class or disadvantaged them greatly. And it was probably unrealistic to expect that in 4 years that would change. But even more so, if you don't, as an administration and as a party, adopt the language and messaging that go with the policy, of course people aren't going to understand where you're coming from. And I don't think the administration even began to articulate a vision of economic fairness embedded in the rules Washington writes and the programs that it administers that broke through to the working class. And, you know, it's a tough issue in the aftermath of the election because you can argue, well, they did all these things for the working class, and the working class not only didn't move their way, in many ways, moved the other way. So therefore, the policies themselves aren't helpful politically. That's a, legitimate, at least a logical argument. I just think it's wrong. Probably Senator Sanders and I would differ in the mix of programs and policies that I think the country needs. He would probably be much more in favor of grand tax and spend safety net programs. I would put the stress more on the writing of rules of the marketplace that don't require vast changes in taxation, but that to me have a much greater power and leverage over helping individuals get ahead in this life.
Well, let's look at some of the examples that are in this extremely action-packed episode of the Washington Monthly. A set of 10 ideas that you think are, or at least an important part of the way forward. There are 10, and each one is densely argued. We can't do all 10, but why don't you just give us 2 or 3 you think are really show what the direction that we should be moving in?
Well, one idea we call Medicare prices for all. We had a great debate in this country in the late 2000 teens and 2020 about Medicare for all, which was essentially providing universal health care to all Americans through the Medicare system. I, for complex reasons, I won't go into why I think that's a non-viable idea. This is different, Medicare prices for all. The basic idea is tie commercial health care rates, the prices your insurance company or you personally pay for procedures and drugs and other things you get through your employer-based insurance from your doctors, from your hospitals, tie those rates to what Medicare pays. If you have commercial insurance and you get a knee surgery, you're likely to pay 25, 50, 200% more, not you personally, but your insurance company, than what the government pays through Medicare. Where hospitals and doctors make their money is in working age people with good insurance provided by their employers. And neither the employers nor the insurers are very good at fighting back against the providers to get decent prices. Plenty of doctors and hospitals make fine livings treating Medicare, predominantly Medicare patients. They make great livings treating people with employer-based insurance. That's because the prices are so much higher in that commercial realm. They don't need to be. If we were to tie the Medicare rates to commercial insurance, what your insurance company pays for your procedures and so forth, the effect of that would be to give every American, every family, a raise. Because where does the money from that high cost health care come from? It comes out of your wages. Employers take that money in pre-tax dollars out of your paycheck to pay the ever higher costs of commercial health care, which has been growing at 2 or 3 times inflation for decades. So simple, easy, not simple because it would be politically difficult, but simple to conceive of, simple to tell, relatively simple to tell average people, hey, if we tie healthcare reimbursement to Medicare rates, you're going to get a multi-$1,000 raise in your salary. And that's going to help working class people even more than everyone else. So that's just one idea. Here's another. Upwards of 10 to 30% of the workforce today is self-employed. They're contractors, they're Uber drivers, they're gig workers, they cobble together jobs from numerous employers. It's a growing part of the workforce. Neither party identifies that huge chunk of the electorate as a group they should think about, message toward, and craft policies to help. And these people need help desperately. They are cut off from most of our social insurance programs. You know, we have a system in the United States where health care, overtime pay, vacations, retirement, uninsurance, all of these things are delivered via your employer. That makes the United States unique. If you don't have an employer, if you're not a W-2 worker, if you're not a formal employee, you don't get those protections. Moreover, a lot of these folks are working in industries that are very concentrated, and they live at the whims of monopoly corporations. The average Uber driver is paying double the fee that he or she was paying 10 years ago. The average small business person with 1 or 2 employees or no employees who uses a swipe for the customers to pay for their services are paying many times more per swipe, per purchase than large companies because of the duopoly between MasterCard and Visa. So there's much that the government could do to make life better for this massive group of the self-employed. And let me give you a little statistic about how little Democrats focus on this, even though they have a good story to tell about some of their policies. In the 2024 Democratic platform, it mentions workers 52 times. It mentions unions 24 times. It mentions the self-employed once. We simply are not focused on this massive group. I'll give you one more example. When we think about racial justice, much of the effort from liberals and the left over decades has been to open up space in elite colleges for Blacks, Hispanics, Native Americans. We've been working on this issue for decades. primarily through what's called affirmative action. And for some years, it actually had a positive effect. In the 60s and 70s, the percentage of African Americans going to elite schools did go up. It flattened in the 80s. It has not moved appreciably since. And it never benefited more than 15, 12% of any given minority group, because most people who go from underprivileged backgrounds who go to college don't go to elite schools. Elite schools provide educations for between 5 and 15%, depending on how you categorize it, of all college students. Most people go to colleges that are not particularly selective, and they don't have to manipulate admissions criteria in order to reflect the communities from which they draw students. And as we know, the Supreme Court has overturned affirmative action, racial remedies in higher education admissions. The other thing we've tried is DEI. These are policies that, for instance, create chief diversity officers at universities, or require students to take anti-racism classes, or professors to sign affidavits that they will advance DEI goals in their teaching. They are predominantly, they're in many different kinds of colleges, but predominantly in elite, highly selective colleges. Very little evidence that they have increased either the college going at these elite schools or the sense of comfort that minority students have at these universities. And they're being carved back again by the right. 7 states have gotten rid of their DEI programs. So in general, we argue trying to advance the goal of racial justice at elite universities hasn't worked. But that doesn't mean there hasn't been progress. There's been tremendous progress. The percentage of Blacks with college degrees, both 4-year and 2-year, has grown by 9.3% over the last decade plus, which is a titch more than among white students. But it's not happening in elite schools. It's happening at regional public universities and community colleges. And those places are deeply underfunded. The average regional community college gets 10% less funding than the average elite flagship, 1/20th the amount of federal grants and contract dollars, and they don't have the vast endowment dollars that elite schools have. So if we want to have a racial justice in America that will actually do some good for large numbers of students, and that's more real than performative, liberals should get behind in a push to increase the funding for schools that do the most good, not just for minorities. These institutions, both regional public universities and community colleges, are some of the great integrated institutions in this country. So that seems to me a no-brainer, and something Democrats can get behind that would draw in a heck of a lot more voters than just Democrats. So those are three ideas.
Paul, you were part of Bill Clinton's administration, right? And one of the achievements of President Clinton was that he led Democrats out of the wilderness in 1992. And to do that, he ran as a quote unquote new Democrat. And a large part of his accomplishment was to win back a lot of these so-called Reagan Democrats, who I guess many of whom are now Trump Democrats. Traditionally Democratic voters, many of them working class, who voted for Reagan in 80 and 84. And part of the Clinton strategy was to co-opt some of the conservative agenda and acknowledge some Democratic failings. That's why he had welfare reform as part of his agenda, reinventing government.
They're a new generation of Democrats, Bill Clinton and Al Gore, and they don't think the way the old Democratic Party did. They've called for an end to welfare as we know it, so welfare can be a second chance, not a way of life. They've sent a strong signal to criminals by supporting the death penalty, and they've rejected the old tax and spend politics. Clinton's balanced 12 budgets, and they've proposed a new plan investing in people, detailing $140 billion in spending cuts they'd make right now. Clinton Gore, for people, for a change.
Are there lessons that Democrats can draw from this, and how much of that Clinton approach has informed how you approach this issue?
Well, the answer to the latter question is a lot. I covered Bill Clinton as a journalist, then I worked for him as a speechwriter, and my admiration for his achievements and his way of doing things is darn near boundless. But we live in different times. And so the specific policies that might have worked in 1993 are not necessarily appropriate in 2025. Moreover, there's some things that the Clinton administration did that in retrospect were ill-advised, to say the least, on things like letting China into the WTO and some aspects of his Reinventing Government program, cutting federal workers when what we really need are more federal workers. But in general, his approach was what you said. It was new. It was tailored to the problems at hand. And for the most part, it worked. Those policies worked. Over 8 years, we saw for the first time in many, many years, increases in the incomes of people in the bottom 10, 20, 30% that matched or exceeded increases in incomes in the top 10 or 20%. And by the way, we saw that too in the last 4 years. So his crime policies, which are very controversial among the left and often disputed as to whether they worked, but nonetheless, if I could boil down his crime policies to more community police on the streets and fewer guns on the streets, either caused or overlapped with the biggest drop in crime we've seen in our history. And getting away from that formulation, I think, which is what many Democrats, certainly on the left, did in the late 2000s, was an enormous mistake. Reinventing Government, which, as I said, was a policy, kind of a campaign by the Clinton administration, which went awry in some ways, but in general was tremendously successful in many ways. The agencies like the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, turned around with the protection of the Reinventing Government umbrella. The VA also became extraordinarily successful at improving the quality of life and life expectancy of veterans under Reinventing Government. What Clinton understood, and I'm afraid politicians today on the Democratic Party don't, though Trump does, is that average people think the federal government needs reform. They think the government wastes their money. They think that too much is siphoned off to programs that don't work, to procedures that are unnecessary. Bill Clinton understood that that's where the public was. He put in place, he campaigned on reforming it. And by the end of his administration, the public's faith in the federal government had climbed considerably from where it had been. In fact, it hasn't been that high very many points since. We at the Washington Monthly have been begging Democrats and writing story after story about the need to have an updated version of Reinventing Government. But again, the problems have changed. Today, the problem, when we have a story about this called Fire the Contractors in the current issue, the problem is not too many federal bureaucrats, it's the opposite. The number of civil servants in the federal government today is unchanged from the Johnson administration, even though the real spending, inflation-adjusted spending of the federal government is 4 times as great. How have we managed to achieve this? By hiring contractors. Contractors make sense for a lot of work, but now contractors are overseeing the contractors. And the federal workforce is so far removed from the actual work, they have no experience, no knowledge, not none, but insufficient experience, insufficient knowledge. And so the waste in the federal government now is in the contracting workforce. And the solution is not cutting federal bureaucrats, it's hiring more of them at higher wages with greater skills so that he can get a lid on the problem. Donald Trump also ran against the federal government, but the reforms he wants to put in place under this new Elon Musk or Vivek Ramaswamy Doge Government Efficiency Commission or whatever it is exactly the opposite of what we need. They're going to start hacking away at the bureaucracy and putting in loyalists as if that's going to solve the problem. And we have a marvelous piece by Don Kettle and another one by Peter Shane in this issue about why that's exactly the wrong way to do it. But, Democrats can't beat something with nothing. And until they have a plan to reform the federal government, they're going to be seen as just standing in the way of progress.
Thanks so much, Paul. This is terrific. And this is only part one of our discussion with Paul Glastris, Editor-in-Chief of the Washington Monthly. Stay tuned next time as we continue our discussion on the latest issue of the magazine and how Democrats can find their way back to power in 2026, 2028, and beyond. Take care. That's it for this week from the Washington Monthly. I'm Ann Kim, and on behalf of my co-host, Garrett Epps, thank you for listening. If you like what you heard, don't forget to subscribe to our channel or wherever you get your podcasts. Have a wonderful week.